In the modern era, eugenics is one of those words considered to represent something so far beyond the pale that even to label something with it can be enough to consign that thing to the untouchable category. But, and I've talked about this before on this channel and elsewhere, eugenics is all around us. It's just that we don't use the label, and eugenics is going to be a big part of the human race in the future. Except that we won't use that label. So let's discuss. It's worth remembering, as Louise Perry points out in a recent article in The Spectator magazine, that while eugenics is considered as beyond the pale in modern society, indelibly associated with the most evil form of racism imaginable, that wasn't the case for a long time. The first eugenics movement appeared in Britain at the end of the 19th century, recognising the emerging science into the power of selective breeding in all manner of animals and plants to select for desirable characteristics. The movement said that the state should determine who should and should not be encouraged or even allowed to reproduce. Not exactly a pitch well framed with a modern mindset, but it was extremely popular at the time. Eugenics was endorsed in principle by the most prestigious scientific journals and associations. Conservatives were big fans of the idea. Black progressives such as Kelly Miller and W.E.B. Du Bois likewise. The Fabian reformer Sidney Webb was a huge advocate, arguing that the state developing a healthier and more intelligent population was not just a virtuous cause, but a duty. Just as well he's not alive to see the modern world, but I digress. Eugenicists were big fans of abortion, one of the tools that could be used then to select those who were worthy enough to make it into the land of the living. No coincidence that the founder of America's Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, was a big eugenicist, as was the founder of the eponymist Marie Stopes in the UK. Marie Stopes the person actually forbade her son from marrying a woman because, although yes, she was beautiful and yes, she was an heiress, those were mere details. She was also short-sighted. Her son ignored his crazy old mama and went ahead anyway, so she cut him out of her will as a result. So it's just as well he married an heiress then, I suppose. I think I can speak on behalf of all of the short-sighted community when I say, what the heck, Marie Stopes? Objections to eugenics were, however, rare before the Second World War, and even after Hitler had taken the concept and rather illustrated just how dark it could go, it still took quite some time before the association between the term and the evil actions became fixed, as illustrated by the fact that the American Eugenics Society didn't feel the need to change its name before 1973. Now it is completely stigmatized. But as Diana Fleischman notes in a recent essay provocatively titled, "You're Probably a Eugenicist," even though we don't use the label, we do engage in some of the practices. Aborting fetuses that are likely to become Down syndrome children is one example. Forbidding marriage and procreation by siblings or cousins is also eugenicist, since it's designed to prevent the incidence of diseases caused by inbreeding. There are a number of other examples, but they're pretty much chump change compared to what's coming. The improving technology has now given us PGT/P, or polygenic screening. Coupled with IVF, such screening enables you to take a batch of embryos, have each one checked for genetic risk factors, such as their vulnerability to a wide range of genetic diseases. But not just that. It can also highlight likely positive traits: height, athletic ability, intelligence, good looks, work ethic. You might imagine how these could be added to as we screw up our living situation and find merit in producing humans better equipped to cope. So we've already talked about whether the humans who will fly to Mars and beyond, assuming anyone ever does, will benefit from targeted genetic modifications to enable them to survive the particularly hostile environments they will face. But suppose it turns out that part of the answer to the fact that, microplastics appearing in all human tissues, could be aided by selecting for genetic traits that are more resistant to harm from such sources. Or indeed, supposing we can push upwards the wet bulb temperatures humans can survive at to enable people to remain in regions where current limits to tolerance are likely to be more regularly exceeded. But those latter ones are unlikely, since they suggest that a state or a scientific body would be analysing future conditions and drawing up a blueprint. That is very old eugenics, and various people would jump on that as unacceptable in the modern age. I mean, you could write half a dozen conspiracy theories that would be certain to spring into existence. You could come up with them in one morning based on that starting point. But the new eugenics, the one that never calls itself by that name, that will be driven from the bottom up. Initially, well-off couples. Who would expect to spend a fortune putting their kids through the best education anyway? So wouldn't bat an eyelid at spending a few thousand on pre-IVF testing to select for example, intelligence. And since we're also developing the technology to create hundreds of embryos at a time from repurposed skin cells, they'll have a lot more embryos to choose from, making the most optimal genetic mix more likely to achieve. Selecting on such a basis is not currently allowed in the United States or the UK or a wide number of other countries. Even if we don't call it eugenics, it's seen as kind of across the ethical line. That, however, has no chance of enduring, because couples will want the best for their children, and because some countries will go against the consensus and offer those services because they can. The idea will become normalised through eugenic tourism, I suppose you could call it, and then eventually the rest of the world will bow to the inevitable and start to permit it under certain ethical and quality restrictions. Extend that over hundreds of years, and who knows where you end up, having normalised ways of thinking about the human race that we would find alien and probably quite horrifying today. In his book, Creating Future People, Jonathan Anomaly posited that widespread use of this screening, if it was restricted, say, to the well-moneyed elites, could end up creating a group of humans so genetically distinct from the rest of us that it would have to be counted as a new species of human as it became incapable of interbreeding with us. A genetically superior subspecies. What could possibly go wrong? None of us will still be here to see that sort of outcome. Nevertheless, we should be alive to how this is going. By the way, when I've talked about this before, I've had certain commenters say, "What a monster I am," because they say it sounds like I approve and I encourage this outcome. Obviously, to do so, in their mind, makes you much of a muchness with Hitler himself. But the point was, and remains, really doesn't matter what I think, based on the sentiments and the ethics of this modern era. It is about as inevitable as anything I can think of, assuming we don't destroy ourselves in the meantime. As Perry concludes in her Spectator piece, parents have historically moved heaven and earth to protect the health and happiness of their children. We should expect those of the future to do the same. And very soon they will have another tool at their disposal, a radical and potentially dangerous tool, but one that any parent with the means to acquire it will almost certainly be unable to resist. Whether you think this is a vision of a dystopia or a utopia, It's a science fiction future that is likely to be social fact in a matter of decades, because unlike the state-driven top-down vision of the Victorian eugenicists, this involves large numbers of people being exactly the way that people have already been, but just handed a new set of possibilities on how that can be expressed. The result is going to be incremental, easy to miss, but profound over a longer time frame.